two different ways of making history, one with the British and one with the Chinese, taking over Hong Kong. Now my question is, under the British colonial rule, did the British schools administrations allow different interpretations of the Opium War? Did they allow the discourses of Opium War, and did they openly admit that they did some villainous things in the Opium War? And my observation is that I've noticed that the mainland Chinese government has been having lots of wonderful museum exhibits of ancient China in Hong Kong, and these are very enthusiastically attended by Hong Kongers. But I can't help having the sneaking suspicion it's a subtle way of giving loyalty to the motherland of China. So, you see these two agendas under the British and Chinese. Maybe someone can talk about what it was like under the British history making in Hong Kong.
Maybe I can respond to the second question that you have about this kind of nationalistic feelings about of Chinese. First time I saw this advertisement on TV, it was kind of odd because that never happened in the colonial day. It never happened until recently. We have like the national song being taught in the TV, and like a film star telling you that you have to love your country. Things like that. It seems so odd. But then I tried to recall the days when I was in Australia and studying over there. Actually, those kind of advertisements did appear in countries like those Western countries, and the people just take it as granted because they have these national feelings. They love their country. They were born in this kind of culture. The Hong Kong, as many people are aware or agree with that, we don't really have this root about who we are. I think before 97, a lot of people in Hong Kong don't think that we are mainland Chinese or we are even Chinese. We are Hong Kongese or Hong Kong, people from Hong Kong. They're not simply as Chinese. So that's the kind of background or the general background of how we changed from like people from Hong Kong to Chinese. And I think what's happening, education, this kind of things, I think it's kind of a natural thing. I don't know about Singapore. I suppose.
Of course, the nationalism very, very strong all the time, but it's also, maybe Hachi, you'll agree with me, it's out of a sense of panic because they feel that they're not getting results, right, from the Singaporeans, so they have to try really hard.
But one of the really, really impressive things that I had in Singapore was the last half an hour before I leave the airport, I was in a taxi. I was with Linda in a taxi to the airport, and we had a half an hour lecture about the Singaporean history, the wonderful leader of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew.
Wow.
But the way that the driver present the great leader, he was not just something that he read on the book and then tell you, but through his own experience, his grow up and everything.
It's justifying how good Singapore is.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did he know you were Hong Kong?
Yeah.
Yeah, he knew you were from Hong Kong, right?
Yeah. But the way that this kind of verbal history, that being followed by normal people from Singapore.
That's never happened to me.
But I also want to make a quick comment because I feel this is so. Can I say this is a very typical situation when cities from two different cities, people from two different cities would back questions from the other party. What do you actually have? What is it there that you have? So are there only two stories? I think, yeah, this is the perception of a lot of people outside Hong Kong, that probably at least we have two major official histories, one regarding the British colonial rule and the other as part of China. But I think I would like all of us here who are from Hong Kong to address this question. As any individual myself, definitely there are far more than two stories. I can tell you like a dozen more that I have acquired growing up in Hong Kong. But this also reminds me of something that you said earlier on, because I really have been in Singapore, so 5 times maybe. Last time I was in Singapore in April, there was a very peculiar experience to me. That was the only time I was in Singapore when I did not go to Orchard Road. If you have been to Singapore, you know Orchard Road is like Nathan Road in Hong Kong. You walk there, I can barely walk smoothly because maybe I'm I'm big, I like to walk fast, I often feel like Orchard Road is such a horrible road. So this time I stay away from Orchard Road. And I felt that I walk from my hotel to substation in the middle of the day, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 11 o'clock, nobody, there's no one around. Seems like the whole city is asleep. Everybody is at peace, at ease, which very much contrasts with what you said earlier. And I'm not saying that you are more right than I am, or I'm more right. I think this is peculiarly one type of question about who you are, where you stand, and what you see. And precisely because this is really what would happen in reality. We need to exchange stories, we need to compile, we need to put together a lot. The other interesting fact would be, yes, the conversation Tim and I had in the car was very strange. This guy kept, persuading us and himself, I think, more how important it is for Singapore to have had Lee Kuan Yew. Otherwise, blah, blah, blah. But I was in many different trips on the cab too. I think one time I traveled with Hector, and we had this cab driver also on the way to the airport. Throughout the trip, we had no chance to talk because he was complaining about how difficult it is to be a taxi driver and all the problems he's got having to raise a kid, how he worries about his daughter, blah, 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 blah. So I feel like even just taking a couple of taxi trips would make a difference in understanding what the city is about. And I grew up because I have been different things, as many people know. Once I was a journalist, and that was the time when I knew that, yeah, Hong Kong does have history, because we have the history of how the rich tycoons became what they were. And so, in fact, at one point, I was my magazine's best writer, writing family stories about Li Ka-shing and all these other people. And yeah, we do have success story. The economic success story has always been the local story. And then you go to the secondary school, you go to the university place, you feel that there's no history class. But at that point, I was very much frustrated by the fact that there's no Chinese Hong Kong history in my education. But now looking back, thank God there isn't. Because we don't need, as some of us have also expressed, we don't need one version of Hong Kong history or one official version. We need many different types of stories. So I stop here, I have more to say.
But don't you think, I mean, to me history is a critical way of thinking about the past that deals with actual truths about the past, facts about the past, but only ever within certain interpretations. But it's always self-aware about this whole process. I mean, maybe there should be a distinction made between history as a critical practice and the rhetorical use of history by politicians or whatever, museums, whatever. And isn't that what you are attacking in a way?
Yeah, but that's the problem. I totally agree with you. The history that we encounter on a day-to-day basis is not academic history. It's entertainment history. It's history as media. It's history at the History Museum. It's the History Channel, right? It's history. It's heritage and tradition. Or it's Chinese art in Hong Kong presented as history, but it's really, in a sense, propaganda. It's history as propaganda as much as this history is critical practice. And I love history, but I find more and more that my enjoyment of history is purely entertainment. And I have no interest in it as historical fact other than to Google and make sure the date was right. But I don't take it in anything else.
Which is important. The question is, who is history written for? At what different multiple points are we consuming history?
Yeah, but I think if we're consuming it like that, it's because we're consuming it as entertainment, so it becomes less and less important. It's just simply trying to feed the taxi driver so he can give a great talk about how powerful the great leader is. They do the same thing in North Korea, so I don't see the difference. It's just being put to use for other purposes.
Let's tie in the two questions that you asked about history and art's relationship with history as a separate question. One question is how to write history, and then what's art's relationship to history. I want to throw in a third term, which is the public. And for me, the notion of the public isn't the people, the general public so much, as a particular space or site where individuals gather and contest things. So if you're talking about the multiple stories that you have, I think what's a real problem is that you have multiplicity of stories and you have a consumer regime, then you get Norman's problem. And that's what we have right now. We're consuming history and we have a multiplicity of consumption. And that's a real problem if you don't have a common public, which is David's point about a critical historical practice that deals with all the differences and tries to make them speak to each other. And that speaking to becomes very important. There may not be consensus, but if this is an imperative toward the public, it's very, very important, because then you do have a sense, not necessarily of the nation, but you do have a sense of the value of remembrance, because it's not just like, oh, I have a personal relationship to June 4th, but when you're there in public and there are so many other people, that really matters. And that's very often incredibly lacking in Singapore, the public. We don't have publics and we don't have diversity in publics, and that's a real problem. And this is where, lately, of course, everybody says such a good thing about Hong Kong is that you have street demonstrations with people from the street, and that's something to be very pleased with. If I may return to the end of history, one of the when Oscar mentions, the kind of words that get bandied about, like world class, what I keep on forgetting. I'm sorry. What Hong Kong is?
A world-class city.
Asia's world city, right? And what the hell is Singapore right now? I forget. Because we've changed it.
It's better than Hong Kong.
We used to be New Asia, right?
We're just as good as
We used to be New Asia, and now I don't know what we are. But I wrote this essay talking about the problem of authenticity. This was called Authenticity, Reflexivity, and Spectacle. And my subtitle was, The Rise of New Asia is Not the End of the World. So it was a real sort of take on some Fukuyama. And see, the problem in Singapore is that you too often get into a one-way debate of just arguing with the government. And even this kind of criticism that tries to deal with multiplicity ends up getting caught in this bind. Even if you're criticizing the end of. While that is an image that there is no history in Singapore, of course there is. And that's what Amanda's project is sort of about, and that, in some ways, I think is also what Zunyan's kind of, evokes, is that there is a playfulness on the one hand, a witnessing and a trauma on the other hand of a complexity that should not, that isn't erased even by the incessant economic activity. History hasn't ended in Singapore. I'm trying to think of maybe a good moment to illustrate that, but nothing comes to mind right now. So maybe if I think of a good example.
Can I make a connection between what Norman said and what David said earlier? I think when I was trying to call more attention to the act of consumption, I'm by no means promoting a kind of populist historiography. In fact, what I was trying to say is, how do we move between the need for critical history? Some people have to do it. And the fact that to most ordinary people, the context of history is in those everyday conversations. So this is like something we need to liaise. And my question will go back to, so what exactly are artists doing? Are artists' intervention into the writing of history purely via fabrication and representation? Could it also be a kind of more documentational type of, facts collection, objects collection type of more? The other question that I would like to raise regarding the writing of critical history would be the problem of writing official history is not a problem in itself. The real problem is what got to be written into history, what got to be included. Then we can do a more ethnographic study of history books. We can turn a lot of history books to see what basically have been included or registered as official legitimate history. We might easily go back to this gentleman's problem. Yes, there might be only two, or we have another Hong Kong report written by a very famous local intellectual. At most, we have that kind of mainstream alternative. I think we need to break away from that. We need to break away from that by rethinking where has the idea of everyday been, have we got critical enough methodology to incorporate the everyday life, everyday practices, the voice of different people? How do we get to cover the true multiplicity of voices in order to make history less alien to the ordinary mind, so that it won't just be the project of the academics. I think this is one question I want to throw in back to this discussion, and want to hear more about how some of the artists present here have been,
Yeah, I want to add up to
participating in
this
that.
question, because within this artistic context, I found, as some of you have mentioned, that it seems like quite lacking of those artistic engagement in so-called representation of history. And I just want to add to that question, did you think about any difficulty in this special Hong Kong situations or context? What makes those artists seems not very sensitive to those issues?
Let me illustrate something from Singapore. I went to a show, and it was in the art space. You had, sort of walls, sort of plywood, false wall, some at certain angles and everything, and sort of an orchestrated walkway, and then there was a lot of video being projected and lights, and there was music playing. And so one section had actually, it was like a short tour of Hong Kong gay or Asian gay cinema. I think a lot of Hong Kong film, a lot of bits of Happy Together and this and that. So you had that, and then you had some animation. So there were very different elements put in. In another room, you had these Americans at our college. They were all sort of Asian Americans, and they all pretended to be as if they were straight from Asia and just come to America. But at the end of the film, you realize that they're all Americans, born and raised in America, and they all speak with, American accents, but they were faking their Indian accents and everything like that. So you had all sorts of different kind of content. But there was one thing that really disturbed the hell out of me. You had clips from 9/11 of the planes crashing into the World Trade Center. You had clips of Nazi propaganda. There's that very famous, I think, Edie Adams photograph of the person being executed on the street in Vietnam during the war. There's also a clip of that, a film clip of that. It's not just a photograph. So you had that. And while that was being shown as an interlude between different parts, there was like really silly pop music, that I had a refrain one more time. So when you see, the plane crashing into, and it wasn't as if that, that was the main subject matter. It almost seemed like just this incidental citation, which pissed me off as hell, because it's so, the casual citation, I find that happening a lot in art in Singapore and the world, right? Where you just appropriate so freely that this image doesn't have an indexical relationship to real death. Sure, fuck the news stations for, circulating this image over and over again. Like Channels News Asia in Singapore, the main news channel, in their promotion of watch Channel News Asia, we're the best TV show, they would show that clip. It's one thing to show it during the news and to continue to report it, but to promote your channel, I've seen once also promoting Channel News Asia where a man is being executed during a riot in Indonesia, being shot in the back of the head. And I find that just so offensive that the news would do it, right? And then when artists are doing it as well, because they feel that once they have this complete license to continue to recycle images, that feeling that it doesn't matter. This is, addressing your point where you have a lot of artists how do they deal with the real? We come to the conclusion so quickly that everything is just image. And I see that happening a lot with artists. And it's very, very disturbing to me.
I want to respond to Linda's question with a project that recently I worked on, because what Norman was talking about, all these various powerful institutions sort of defining history. So are we going to counterbalance the critical writing of history? I think the other important part is exactly the public's participation and to nurture critical skill. But I'm also interested in the other part is to taking back the right to interpret, to write history by the public as well. And there's a project that I work with the Lingnan University students, and that is look at Twin Woods, because we all talk about West Kowloon, and now we have a West New Territory project. I'm going to take a look into the poorest district in Hong Kong. and just collect local mythology. And one student collect, and then they refabricate some story along with it. So one student collects the Twin Moons Highway ghost story, which is a very popular one. So there's a lot of ghosts along the Twin Moons Highway. And then later on, it actually is a little experience of himself and why she see ghosts and all this. They start talking about it. It's fascinating because first of all, it's a historical research because there are a lot of Twin Moon ghost story because there's a lot of car accident and because there was a fully built highway. And why they need to build a highway? Because in the 70s, the government want to move all these poor working class people all the way to out to the new territories where they build this factory site so that they can all work there and then can they stay there. You see, so for some of them still need to work downtown, they have to travel this long distance. So this idea of being marginalized, this sort of haunting experience of almost like 1 hour trip after late, a full day's work late at night going back. It sort of accumulates so much kind of ghost story. And what I find is pretty fascinating is when she start talking about her own experience of ghosts. I don't know whether it's true or not. They'll start asking her about, why do you encounter all these ghosts? And she said, because of loneliness. And that kind of psychological response of being marginalized, being far away. Now, I cannot tell which part is history and which part is not. But I think there is a very deep kind of understanding of historical memories and respond to it from a very, very realistic point of view. Now, I don't know how should I characterize this, and it doesn't really matter. It is in fact an artistic response. But the kind of critical and personal and psychological response to history is so powerful that I was overwhelmed by it. So until today, I'm still asking this question: are there other ways to deal with history, like a creative response?
Can I also come in again? Sorry, actually, this brings me back to my immediate response watching the two pieces of the two works presented here. What immediately came? I actually watched it yesterday here. My immediate response was I like Hozunin's piece because it's short, it is fun, it's concise. The other one is a little bit unbearable. At the first screening, it's a bit boring. But that was only my initial response because thinking about everything, especially at this point of the discussion, I felt that for Hong Kong in particular, this is also related to Warren's question. At this point of Hong Kong culture, I think there is very much the need for, I hate to use the word balance, but let me just use it for the time being. There might be a better word for balance between discourse and ethnography in terms of history writing. Discourse meaning you have a couple of facts there, you tie them together, apply a kind of causal relation, a causal logic, so that it becomes a smooth story that can be told, repeated, transmitted, and broadcast and multiplied. Ethnography is a far less attractive project because you have to be there on the field. Things change day from day. You have to be very diligent about making documentation, taking notes of the things that actually happen. And after a long while, you are still wondering about trying to think of the conclusion that you might bring to these facts in order to make the piece communicable or attractive. When I look at these two pieces, I think these two pieces, ironically, are about that tension between discourse and ethnography. Portunin's piece made me think a lot about the importance and the inevitability of narrative as the core of history writing, which is really about how to keep going in the activity of narration. There's no end. The worst thing about narrative is narrative closure, when you come to a conclusion, a clear-cut ending of something. So Hozunin's piece is interesting because it plays with, it abandons absorption, narrative absorption, which is the norm of narrative consumption. It it prefers alienation, it prefers a lot of things that I think Wang described, the use of a pop star, the use of the blue screen capture method, and the very highly performative style, everything. The very unnatural use of rhetoric. It keeps narrative open, and yet it again backs the possibility of having more than one narrative. And also, one grand issue about historical narrative is to put a finger onto the origin and the beginning, and all of these things are abandoned. But I tend to like the second piece a lot more at this point, because the second piece is very boring, but it reminds me of the importance of going back to the abandoned politics, the abandoned use of the talking head in documentary. If some of you know the history of documentary, the talking head has not been a very popular rhetoric in documentary filmmaking, at least in the past 20 years. Or it has only been brand named as TV infotainment program. Only these programs would use a talking head. But I see there's a charm there about just using talking head, people using their own language to say whatever they want. And the funny thing is, the narrative power of the piece is how these things are juxtaposed together into some kind of archive. So I keep thinking about the problem in Hong Kong. On the one hand, we have the problem of artists and historians always relying too much on typical images, typical narratives, typical representation, the typical. At the same time, we don't have the legitimacy to feel that if I don't say something that is typical, I will be listened to, or my work will carry a sense of importance or weight. There's a lot of things that is getting into our way as artists, and as critics, and as historians. I kept thinking about the presence of Phoebe here, who is from the Asian Archive. I think there's a lot we need to do about writing up the history of Hong Kong art and writing up of Hong Kong history. Because there's this great divorce between the practice of representation, which a lot of us is doing, very easy, very happy, very rewarding, fruitful, and yet there are all these archives sitting there. Nobody is doing anything about the facts, the documents that have been created. No document is neutral. No document is singular in its interpretation.
And no institution is either.
Yes.
It's not just the documents that aren't neutral.
Right.
The organization is not neutral either.
And why Asian Archive collected some material and not others.
Yes,
and not others. All of these issues should be brought together onto this platform in order to really examine what it is. I think at least one very fruitful thing I have heard over here is the desire to open up, so the conclusion would not come so soon. I think what Oscar has been saying is that keep the process going. Make people question, make people feel more alienated or strange about what they are receiving, instead of keeping them there to have a very safe, happy reception, just like we go to a Hollywood film. At the end of it, we walk out the cinema. Okay, lights up, sunshine, back to life, that sort of reception. So I think I have talked too much really, but I want to really invite, we have about 20 minutes left for a really open floor discussion. Please ask questions from your own position as an artist, as a teacher, as a media practitioner, as an academic, as a journalist, whatever. And question all of the things that we have talked about here. Tell us more of what's actually happening here. Since we have guests from Singapore, maybe this is the chance you want to hear more voices that you don't usually get to hear, or via Parasite, or via more official channels.
We have social worker here.
I think there are many.
This video we saw here on the creating kind of a synthetic history. Is that something that, I mean, you have the sense that artists right now are creating some myths which might be synthetic now, but then kind of become part of the national kind of identity, and also becomes like a myth as real, that this will be successful. I mean, we scoffed with the kind of Lee Kuan Yew's the present Prime Minister. He kind of made a 25-minute speech, and all of a sudden this became official history. and it was very clear this was like kind of a synthetic.
Yeah.
But then it finally becomes something more rooted in kind of national psyche. Or, do you think this, like in 100 years, finally this will become real myths?
I like a lot of works that are ambiguous, and I think they're resistant to closure. I think this film is. I was at the last Documenta, and it was my first time to document, first time to Germany. And I really enjoyed the show, but on the one hand, I was also very disturbed by it, because there were lots of documents, a lot of documentary works, but I felt a lot of them were more about truth as something that we arrived at, rather than this fraught process of trying to reconcile with the real, or constantly engage it. So there were all these sort of statements about this is the traumatic situation, but one which I really liked, and I felt it was an exceptional piece because it had humor. It was by the Atlas Group, the Lebanese artists who deal with the Civil War, and it was fictional history. There was one exhibition, and the story behind it was that there was all these historians, these Marxist historians, and they like to go to the race course, and they bet. And they have this photographer who sort of intentionally will take the picture, a little bit slower or later when the horse crosses the finish line. And so they're all betting on how much, so all these kind of fictional stories, and he fills it with very, very interesting characters, because the historians will then start making these remarks, and start saying things. And it gives you an insight to what is real, but of course it always complexifies it and makes you doubt and makes you wonder. There's a story about, someone being, doing surveillance and everything, and I really liked that work. And what was very funny was that one review that I read thought it was entirely serious. But most of the time, I think the Atlas Group are very, very resistant to really being installed as myths. So they might be a continual ingredient where they're always disturbing a process of mythology, and they get perpetuated and circulated. But I don't think they will have this kind of closure, like you said, with the Prime Minister's speech, where it then becomes installed. It's not to say that there aren't artists who try to do that, and I think in Singapore, somebody who might be in that position, a very important artist, is Ong Keng Sen of theater works. I think some of the things that he does he's interested in actually making myths to install them, whereas let's say another playwright, the founder of the substation, Kuo Pao Kun, I think his allegorical theater piece has always been about a resistant position. He's now being appropriated as, he was detained and tortured in the 70s, stripped of his citizenship. And then when he died, of course everyone's all trying to appropriate him as part of his national figure. So I don't know what's going to happen there, how he's going to become, authority. It's all very, very soon to tell. So he would be an interesting figure to see what happens, because his work has always been very, very critical, and whether he becomes part of the mainstream. But with some of the visual art work, like something like this, I think they're precisely about disturbing. Some of these sort of very, very visual theater pieces, like Kang San, they're not so clear about whether they want to perpetually disturb. So it's an important question, but I hope I've given some examples of some of the complexity of how artists have responded to that.
Yeah, I think I want to respond to that not as an academic, as an artist. I find the idea of an artist who intends to insert him or herself into history in an effort to change it or affect it unbelievably egotistical and pretentious. And I would never consider doing that. I find that something like it's the classic sort of modernist sort of approach, right? Is that I'm going to make work that changes history and create a myth. So I find that incredibly, almost a ridiculous thing to do. In fact, and it's not just ridiculous on the surface, it's disingenuous, right? It's something patently useless about it, right? To try and take that kind of position as an artist that you're going to affect history. Because it's like an activist artist socially activist art, where the artist actually is the only person that benefits, not society. Like they're the ones who get the most out of it. They get the press and the money. And the cause they're promoting through their work is never really helped. I think those are very similar approaches. So I find this whole idea almost reprehensible, really, to be honest with you. Somebody has to say that. I'm sorry.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, but, you know, notwithstanding, you know, your position, which I'm very sympathetic to, there are people who do
Oh,
still.
of course they do. That's
Yeah.
why I'm saying that. There's nobody, there would be no reason.
But there are pictures, I mean, there are paintings out there or images long time ago, like in Europe, which kind of become part of the national identity. Maybe the artist, when he made it,
It's the first thing I said, though. Maybe you didn't hear me, but that's the first thing I said when I spoke of it. That I think that's why history has changed now. History isn't, it could have been written by the artists in the past, but I don't think it can be or should be today. I think that's a misunderstanding of an artist's role in society. We shouldn't be the ones, if we're complaining about the problems of writing history, then why should we be simply replacing ourselves as the master who should write history? That's just as bad. I don't see how that's a better way to do it. Like we shouldn't. How do I know what's a better history than a historian? None of us are suggesting we should be rewriting it because we know better, right? Because that's what you're implying when you say that.
Well, isn't you taking it too seriously? Like, artists writing history, but we're just recording what we think, and 100 years later, people referencing artists, referencing pop stars, referencing whoever together, what history is about. So we're just part of it.
I'm talking about intent, the intent to do it. I agree with you, but
No, I think that's, you know, I mean, let me, I think, you know, the point you're making about the relationship of art to history has changed, you know, that point. Because certainly, you know, if you think about, I can think of an example of poetry in Singapore. There was a poet, you know, when Singapore became independent, literature, you know, took on this mantle of trying to be the nationalist voice. Less the the visual arts sort of did as well, but you really had these people feeling that they were, in intention, trying to be part of history. I mean, subsequently, today, you know, a lot of the practitioners, I don't think they have that intention. By and large, like you said, you know, they're recording their thoughts and they really just want to be individuals in the public realm. But there are a few.
And Jeff Wall does. I think Jeff Wall has stated quite clearly his intent to be the painter of modern times, and the art photographer of the modern time. He wants to replace Manet. And Jeff Koons has played his little history game. A lot of artists.
Yeah, and you know, I can name somebody in Singapore. I think Ong Keng Sen, you know, has those ambitions. And you know, I respect Keng Sen. We have this, we have a tense relationship, you know, as a critic and as a producer. But there are, and so you know, it's important to also notice who are the people who are trying to do that. You know, become the myth makers.
I think I take Norman's point. You don't want to try and artists don't want to take over the practice of history, but I think if you're making art that deals with questions of history, probably your relation is going to be oppositional to some hegemonic rhetoric of history. You want your writing of history or somehow to connect in to change stuff. You know, like how do you go about making sure that something of that happens rather than it just gets lost? Like, I'll give you an example, like the June 4th demonstrations. Now, you could say the Pillar of Shame is a very simple kind of artwork when it was sitting there, and in some sense it did have some function within that demonstration, and that demonstration definitely had some oppositional historical functions. Will again tonight, you know. So it can have a political effect. Yeah, but then there are at least 1 year there was a time when some real artists doing real art were right at the edge of the demonstration with their real art, but somehow that didn't connect to history because it wasn't somehow connected into the main event going on there. You know, they were just doing art or something like that. So there is some question about when does art actually become effective as part of the...
Maybe I'm just a little upset about it because I'm so sick of art that is referencing art and art history all the time. I mean, it's such an insider's elite game. If you haven't done 4 years of art history, you don't get all the references. And I think I'm just kind of tired of that. You know, I just find that tired. It's just boring. And I think the art about history is, to me, just, that's a personal problem. I find it boring. Because I don't think this proposed work is about history at all. It's not about, it's about myth. It's about the public image of Singapore. It's nothing to do with history in my mind at all.
Or in my word, it's just, when you keep talking about things, you're making works about history, I think it's a very boring topic sometimes to me too. But I think the problem really is, when we think of history, our association is really associated with great events. History can be about very specific things.
Yeah.
For that piece of work, I think it's very specific. It's not claiming itself to engage in grand topics of history writing, but something very specific about the fun, the humor about the origin, and the multiple origin. I think in that sense, a problem about history is the same as the problem about everyday life that can be engaged.
Yeah, there's a great moment in the film where the jester and Tom are there, and they're discovering the island. He goes to shoot what he thinks is some kind of beast, and the jester said, he says, "Oh, I killed the tiger." The jester says, "No, you didn't kill a tiger. You killed a lion." He goes, "Well, I saw it. I'm pretty sure it was a tiger because there's basically no lions here." He goes, "No, you killed a lion because if you kill a lion, you get the land. If you kill a tiger, you don't." Right? And that's a clear comment on this notion of history as a right, as ownership.
I know there are a lot of artist students from the art school, so maybe you have some quick comments to make.
Or not so quick.
Or about long comments.
You can make long comments.
Actually, for me, art is very personal. I don't care what is history or something else. I'm a human being. I'm alive. That is history. I don't care what about that. I don't really care. I just like what I paint. I don't mind my pain, and nobody knows. I don't care because I paint it. I like it. In my world, in my art world, it's very selfish. I always say in my painting, it's very selfish. I don't care who. I don't care. Nobody's noticed because I know it.
Yeah, but there's a difference between saying history is maybe irrelevant or boring and not having a critical engagement with your culture, right?
Yeah.
I think if you get too far inside yourself, it's very dangerous. It's too much introspection means you're just as boring because you're the only one that cares about your works. I mean, there's a difference between what we're saying here about history as a subject and your involvement with the world, right? These are two separate
I
things.
think if I paint something in my past or my experience, it will show up a little bit. I don't think
Of course.
okay, I'm Chinese. I won't paint a Great Wall because I've never been there, right? And I just know that there is a Great Wall in China, but so for what? I don't understand it. I can't feel it. Or maybe it's my personal thinking of that. And I really care is okay. Painting is my. I like it. I like art, and actually I'm not really care about that. The other things that or whatever the other people's thinking.
Yeah, but it's a fine line what you're saying and just pure apathy too. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying you're wrong.
I have two questions for you. One, when you like art, I mean, you like making art,
Yeah.
right? But do you also like looking at art?
Yeah.
Now, the art that you look at, that art very often has a very different relationship in terms of its practice. Because as an artist, I can respect that you don't have these sort of claims to the public. You don't really, you do it for yourself. But a lot of the work that you're looking at, its conditions of production, its intention and everything, is to make a claim on the public. Because sometimes an artist doesn't make work for herself, but she makes work to communicate. And that is really the drive. It's not like, oh, I really enjoy painting. No, I really feel I have something to say to a lot of people. And so you enjoy that art. But yourself, you don't actually have that same relationship.
Yeah.
So,
But different people have their personality. Somebody likes communicate with the audience. So in my case, maybe I'm not interested to communicate with people. Actually, my painting doesn't have to engage. Actually, my painting doesn't have to have somebody collect it. Maybe I collect myself. It's also all right.
But do you think
Right?
that? No,
But there's a lot of problems with that approach because I'm not trying to make a joke. I'm not trying to make a joke. I'm serious. A lot of us would believe that half of art making is what happens after we let go of it, after we finish it, right? The public relationship to our work. For me personally, if I just made something and I left it at home and I put it in a drawer, to me it's not art. To me that doesn't make art until I do something with it, until somebody engages with it. That's a personal system for me, right? I don't believe I've finished unless it's out there and I've done something with it. That's why I just call it work, right? What you're describing to me is just process. It's not, I don't really count that as art. And I mean that as an individual, not as anybody else. I think you'll run into that a lot too.
Well, I can accept it, honestly. I mean, I hardly show them except with the Parasites work. But I do think that we all have our audience. But the audience may be your boyfriend, maybe. We don't have to go through this format. But I think when you create, you do. At least personally, I think I have my audience too. But it's will be extremely small group, and I don't care about exhibition. As a curator, it's kind of strange. But, but I mean, if you really look at it in such a way, it's okay. But let's go back to the history part. I think it is important to recognize there are many, many different kinds of history. The grand ones and the very personal ones. And when we put this all together, and then it's history. And I think we should encourage as much as possible different kind of history being written.
Do you think, I'm part of the student group here, do you guys think young artists in Hong Kong do not look at history or to history as a subject as much as other places like at the moment like Chinese art? It's like everyone deal with modern Chinese history, whereas compared back to Hong Kong, we were like completely deaf to that. And I'm just wondering.
Well, obviously, I can't say anything
several
about.
of us here who teach the art of Linda. I do, and Hector does. There's several people in the room that can answer that question.
But let me just say a little bit about Singapore. Let's say artists who are practicing in their 20s. What I think is interesting, Zunyan, for instance, we had an exhibition in the substation of the Australian. There was a painter, Australian painter living in Singapore. She painted the forests, eucalyptus forests. And I liked the show. It was a simple painting show, but it was very, very enjoyable and it was very interesting works. He didn't really like it, and I think he made a comment once. Maybe I'm mistakenly attributing it to Zunyan, but he was talking about he has problems with landscape, right? And I think someone like Amanda, on the other hand, who's in her, Zunyan is about 30, right, or almost 30, 30-ish then. Amanda is 50-ish, right? And it's very interesting that an older generation of artists have a lot to do with responding to becoming artists because of the changes in Singapore society, a certain discomfort with that. Now, artists in their 20s, those changes are normalized. So they're living with that. And one of the changes in Singapore has, of course, to do with how everything's changed sort of geographically. Constantly, buildings change, neighborhoods change. So people in their 40s, and above, they were traumatized by that. People in their 20s, it was, I have to move house. My old neighborhood gets demolished. I don't remember, where I grew up as a child. Who cares, right? But people much older did care. So it's interesting how they then respond to certain issues because of that sort of social experience. And I think it does reflect in practice. Some people can be very, very sophisticated about it and recognize that issue, but they may not feel it as much, and then you can see it in their art. So, you know, Zhu Yan's, I think, thoughtful. I think he's an incredible, thoughtful artist, and not everybody's, you know, regardless of their ages, is thoughtful. But, you know, a comment like, I don't really, you know, have this sort of emotional connection. I think that comes out in his practice. I mean, in subtle ways. So that's how I would respond to your question, sort of like, you know, from a Singaporean perspective. So, is that
Are the teachers, David, at
I think he's talking about art students,
Yeah.
actual art students. So I mean, I think.
Artist and teacher myself, and I want to make a comment about the difference between art making and history writing. And I'm not sure if it would be productive to think about this difference with reference to the difference between, well, I guess both of them are representation of experience. And when we talk about, you know, doing a representation of experience, there are different means to do that. I don't think that artists have, you know, special means to have more legitimacy in representing that than, you know, the so-called historian. But when you think about this difference, I wonder if it's productive to think about the difference between the discursive versus the figural. So versus the historian might, you know, use words to write a history sometime, you know, most of, I guess right now they are accompanied by images and so forth, but still it's very much emphasized on the discursive over the figural. Whereas in art practice, I would argue that there is a lot of stake placed on the figural in making artwork. And I guess that might be a different, you know, just not necessarily more superior, but at least a different model for doing that. I just wonder, you know, I guess just want to hear the speaker comment on that.
No, it's a good point. I think that goes back to the original idea I was saying, that I think that was how it was traditionally. That there was sort of this divide. That it was history was text and art was visual. But now most contemporary art is extremely textual. It requires quite a bit of text to understand it. And you have to really, I mean, every artist now has to be a part-time theorist practically to function in the world today. And I keep telling my students that you cannot present your work without being able to talk about it. It's part of the requirement in my classes now. They have to stand up and say something, which makes a lot of Hong Kong, not only is it that hard to do, but they have to do it in English, which makes it doubly hard. So I mean, I really feel for them, right? But it's something, so I mean, I think that's a change, that's all. It's an evolutionary change.
Yeah, I'm also trying to make this argument because referring to what you were saying, Linda, earlier about the multiplicity of history or multiplicity of truth, I suspect, you know, within words or text, that there is a certain linearity in there, and it's hard to occupy multiple sites at once. But whereas it's in images or, you know, art, not the multiplicity of stories, not only within an exhibition with different artists, but within a single artwork, that you're able to occupy that multiple site at once.
It's a complex question, but my immediate response would be two. First of all, I think there's no need to draw a clear distinction between the textual, the figurative, and the narrative. Even in a painting, there's always a narrative dimension there. The problem we often run into would be because we heavily rely on one type of definition of narrative, which relies extremely on linearity. Linearity is not a problem, but when we say multiplicity, it's not the opposite of linearity. Multiplicity, in fact, it means many things. It might actually mean keep engaging in a form of linearity. Linearity can be played with. Linearity is, you know, what exactly it is. It's just to pull things in a kind of, you know, a temporal kind of arrangement. So I don't know whether I'm addressing your question or not. But the other thought that I had thrown down, which is also related to some of the questions raised earlier on, would be, here we are not trying to say that artistic practice should also be a historiographic project. This is not what we are trying to do. But we are only bringing in one thought about artistic creation based on the two works invited here, which has a very clear intention in engaging themselves, the artists engaging themselves in the history of writing. And I was very amazed that, well, I often thought that ethnographic research belongs to anthropologists and cultural studies people. No, you can actually do visual ethnography by juxtaposing interviews. We often think that, mythology is a kind of narrative, but this is an extremely theoretical piece, even though it is very, kind of tongue-in-cheek.
And there's a long tradition of ethnographic art and contemporary art.
Yes.
We have 40 years of tradition. People like Mary Kelly and a number of artists who did it. Probably the person who would fit this question the best is Trinity Minha, of occupying multiple positions at the same time.
I mean, she is an
Well, I like her. I think she deals with this question exactly. Right? She says the way to avoid this problem is to occupy multiple positions at the same time. Right? Never let them pin you down. Right? That's how you do it. Right? If you don't let them say you're taking this position, you're not an academic, you're not a curator, you're not a filmmaker. You're all those whenever you want to be those. Right? And you have to be. That's hard. That's like introducing doubt into history. Right? That is hard to do. It's easy to write history with facts because all you have to do is write fucking dates, right, and add it all up, and that's
yeah, sometimes and I think maybe for Hong Kong we should do that somehow.
Well, I would say a lot of art historians, that's all they do.
But I do have a third point to make. I think ultimately the point of having the group here today is not to say that, from now on we should bear in mind the project of history writing and turn this into our artistic practice. That's not what I mean, because I think we'll easily move into propaganda instead of other things. But I often think that who are the people? There is a more complex community in history writing than we realize. We often think the historian is that figure, but I think the historian is only the technician in the historiographic project because he writes better, he has training, he's more aware of the loopholes, the problems in narrativity. But I think the group here tells me something, that there are other people who are very necessary in the writing up of a comprehensive local history or a local art history, which we haven't really even moved into, which is a topic I'm very interested in. The critics, definitely. Social critics, people who write columns, people like Jasper whose trade is to write art criticism, people who are involved in making works, people who are running gallery space like Parasite, people who are teaching like David and Norman and Heike and Ryan, and these other teachers, Stella, who has not said a word yet. There are a lot of people who are engaged in this, and I think that these people all play a role in writing up some kind of history. So I'm actually, before we go, I'm very curious about what we think, or perhaps nobody wants to talk about it, how we have been writing up the history of local art in Hong Kong. I think a lot of the questions we have raised could actually be brought in to bear light on, because I think in a sense we are very much torn between a documentary mode, which is to say who, when, what, how, why, make what kind of work, and so that's, in fact we still need that list to be created, so our chronology, in a sense, is not even in place.
Well, it is, it's just not published.
Yes, it's not published.
It's not easy.
So much linked to other projects like dating, meeting someone you're in love with, how to take your telephone bill.
But don't you think the only people that are interested in all those facts and dates are more art historians? I mean, it's like the archiving art seminar at the Art Center, right? The talk was all about how much we need more archives so the PhD students can do more research. I mean, who gives a shit if they have enough research? If they have a problem, they should go get it. But I mean, that can't be our main concern, right? Is to get all the data so that the art historians and historians can have more to write about. These people have expressed on several moments here they don't care, right? So
I mean, it's fine that they don't care, but I think if someone is going to write history, that is part of that story, and this is important.
that is.
And there are all these notes we need to put on the table to make a kind of turn the project of history into a project of connectivity. I try to tie up everything together to see that art making is not as simple, as romantic, as idealized as in dream. And as Parasite, they're constantly in the problem of trying to find more money. It's a very complicated project. So that is the reality of art. If we want to confine ourselves to creation of work, it's fine. There's a moment for everything, for everybody. Hey, time's up.
You wrapped that up very well.
Yeah. I think we have some closure there. Maybe, unless there are any final.
Did you have a final?
No. I don't have any final comments. Just to thank everybody again, and thank everybody who's spoken, and thank everybody from Parasite.
And the chairman or the curator of this event, any final publicity comments?
There's no end.
I wish we have more of these, more participants that are, this is good.
Okay. Please stay around. Grab the video. You can go up to have your own personal cinema or stay around to talk. When will be leaving tomorrow, so this is the final opportunity to meet you. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.